Okay, thank you everyone. John, thank you very much for that presentation. I'll be taking back some of those learnings to the team back in IMCA. So good morning everyone, my name is Mark Holmes. I'm the Safety and Security Manager at IMCA, but also a change to the advertised schedule. I'm actually been here invited to speak a little bit about the industry I have come from. I joined IMCA back at the start of this year. But before then, most of my career has been in mining. And I spent around 13 years working at another industry association called the International Council of Mining and Metals, which is a mining and metals association bringing together some of the world's largest mining companies in the world. Then after that, I moved to a company called Anglo American, which is a global mining company working in its group safety department. So I just want to provide some learnings, some cross-industry learnings for you here today, as well as bring in some of the IMCA work that we've been working on at the moment. So this is not about mining being better. It's not about being a sort of copy-paste of an approach. It's about what one high-risk industry has learned, sometimes quite painfully, that may actually help another. And so today I want to cover three things. First is the IMCA's 2025 safety data and what it's starting to tell us. Second, what mining learned from years of fatality prevention work. And third, why critical control management gives us a practical way to move from data to prevention. So I want to start with one number, and that's 1,098. That is the number of fatalities recorded by ICMM member companies during the period when I was leading health and safety at their organisation. So that number has really stayed with me as I've moved into marine contracting. Because once you work with fatality data year after year, you stop seeing that safety performance as just a graph or a rate. Those are people who did not go home to their friends and family. Over a similar period, IMCA contractors recorded around 115 fatalities. And so the point here is not really to compare mining and offshore as if they're the same, because obviously they're not the same industry. But the patterns there are familiar enough that we should pay attention. The latest IMCA safety data will be published later in June. So today, I'll show you just an early view on some of the key messages. But I think the simple message behind this is simple. We should not need to learn the same fatal lessons just because it's from a different industry. So my argument today is simple. Improving injury rates is not the same as controlling serious harm. That does not mean injury rates are useless or not meaningful. They show trends, they support benchmarking, they help us understand part of the safety picture. But they do not always tell us whether the controls that prevent fatalities are working. So I want to frame the talk around three ideas. One, data tells us where to look. Two, critical controls tell us what must work. And shared learning tells us how to improve together. This is an advanced view of the IMCA 2025 safety data, and the headline picture is mixed. Some indicators, or some of the injury indicators, are moving in the right direction. Total recordable and total lost injury times are down for both the total numbers and those just attributed to offshore, which is encouraging. And that goes to some of the hard work that our member companies are actually doing to address safety within their own organisations. The reported hours are broadly the same, broadly stable compared to last year, just over 1 billion hours worked in total, with offshore hours equating to about 500 million, so about half of that. But we also had 7 fatalities reported, and that's just what was reported. I think what John was mentioning along with a lot of the information we collect at IMCA, is not a requirement of membership. So that number could, as I say, it's just reported numbers. It may not be the full picture. We also noted that the number of reported safety observations are also down that happen at our operations. So we have traditional injury indicators improving while the fatality picture is worsening. So that is exactly why we need to be careful about what the data is telling us and what is not telling us. If we only look at injury frequency, the story looks quite positive. If we look at serious harm, the story is a bit more uncomfortable. There's a lot of stuff in here. I'm not expecting you to be able to see this, and we'll have the slides available afterwards. But on this slide, what I really want to try and drive home is the point that fatal risk does not move neatly along with injury rates. So the top left graph shows fatalities and fatality rates. They jump around from year to year. Fatal events are relatively rare, but when they do occur, they change the whole picture. So we need to be careful about taking too much comfort from one good year. The top right graph shows injury rates have generally improved over time, but as I mentioned earlier, the safety observation frequency has come down in the latest data set. That may be a simple reflection of a change in reporting approaches, definitions on how observation systems are being used, but it is worth asking whether it could be a weak signal. Are there fewer issues, or are fewer issues being reported? Bottom left shows the correlation between the fatality rates and the lost time and total recordable injury rates, and it's showing it's weak. And I think that really supports the broader point that injury rates do not explain fatality risk particularly well. And the bottom right shows that energy-related and dropped object LTIs have reduced significantly, which is positive. But line of fire has increased, while falls and muscular injuries have remained relatively flat. So the data gives us signals, not simple answers. Some are encouraging, some are uncomfortable, and some need further investigation. But none of these themes will, I'd imagine, surprise a lot of you in the room, and that's part of the point here. These are not obscure hazards that we're dealing with. They are known, they're repeated, and they appear across companies, regions, and sectors. So the question is not whether we can name the risk. The harder question is whether the controls for these known risks whether they're strong enough, and whether they're working, whether work is actually being done. Just skip ahead there. So I want to just move on to a few 4 lessons from the mining industry that I can bring over that I think can translate well to the offshore and the marine environment. So as I mentioned, not because mining has actually solved fatality prevention, it certainly hasn't, but because mining has wrestled for years with the same problem. How do you improve general safety performance while still giving enough attention to the events that can kill people? So the first lesson is the zero fatalities mindset. Mining had to become much more explicit about fatality prevention as its own area of focus. The term zero harm can mean different things to different people, whereas zero fatalities and the approach to zero fatalities is a lot more clear. It doesn't mean lagging indicators like injury rates are bad measures, but it has the potential sometimes to dominate the safety conversation. A site can have a good injury rate and yet still have weak controls around fatal risks. The second is safety leadership at all levels. Fatality prevention cannot come from the HSE departments alone. It needs senior leaders who make decisions, not just supporting campaigns. They stop work when controls are right, or not right, sorry. Invest in stronger controls. They challenge production pressures They ask the awkward questions when everything is green on our nice little dashboards. It also needs strong frontline leaders because they are the ones who actually translate company intent into the reality of the job at hand at sea. The third lesson is learning from the past. So mining has had to confront repeated fatality patterns. Some lessons were learned more than once, and I imagine they will continue to be learned more than once. So deep sharing is not easy, but if we only share the safe versions of learning, we limit what the industry as a whole can actually learn together. And fourth is risk management and critical controls. So knowing the fatal risks is not enough, and having a risk register or procedure is not enough. If a critical control is weak, missing, or not understood, we need to know that before someone gets hurt. And if it is, it may show up as being red in our nice little traffic light system dashboards. And this in itself shouldn't be a failure to hide. It's a chance for us to actually fix something while there is still time. And so the real question is, which controls must work to prevent a fatal or catastrophic event? And are those controls actually in place and effective where the work is actually being done? And that's where I want to focus on in the next couple of slides. So this slide sets up some basic logic of critical control management. The first point is simple. The majority of fatal events are known, and so are many of the controls. That is true in mining, and I think that's probably true in offshore and marine industries as well. So we are not starting from a blank sheet. The second point is more counterintuitive, but more can be less. If everything is critical, nothing is critical. Long lists of controls can look reassuring, but they are difficult to understand and implement, and also to verify at times. The more specific we can be about the controls that really matter, the more likely they are to be, that they're going to be applied properly. The third point is that the most severe incidences are associated with failures to implement known controls effectively, rather than not knowing what the control should be. So this graph from ICMM fatality data helps to make that point. What it shows is that the bars on the left-hand side here, it says control execution being ineffective was a dominant contributor by some margin to those fatalities that had occurred, compared to with the other topics, which were controls being absent or not identified or poorly designed. So it really enforces that central critical control message that many fatal events are not the failures of knowledge. They're the failures of implementation, verification, and discipline around known controls. And that leads to the fourth point, which is that some controls are more important than others. And those are the critical controls. They need greater attention, clear ownership, and more disciplined verification. So this is where critical control management as a whole comes in. So we have high-risk work, and that has high consequence hazards. We know that traditional injury rates have limits, and we know that known controls still fail. And this is the gap that critical control management is designed to fill. So ICMM, International Council of Mining Metals, first published its critical control management guidance around 10 years ago in 2015, and was subsequently updated and released earlier this year, and it sort of built on and drawn on 10 years or a decade of implementation and sort of real operational experience in mining. So the guidance sets out a practical 9-step process covering the whole management process in this little circle diagram here. but at its simplest, critical control management asks 5 practical questions. What are the fatal hazards? What are the unwanted events? What controls are critical? What does good look like for those controls? And how do we verify and act when those controls are weak? So it moves that conversation from we have a procedure to is the control that prevents serious harm actually working today? And I would generally recommend you going, visiting the ICMM website and looking at this guidance document. It's freely available. As I say, while it's written for the mining industry, I think the logic travels into offshore as well. So this slide is one of the more challenging parts of critical control management and asks us to be much more precise about what we mean by what control is. So in safety, we've called a lot of things controls. A lift plan, a permit, a toolbox talk, a procedure, a training record, a risk assessment, a maintenance system. All these things are really important, but do they actually stop harm on their own? A permit does not stop a load falling. A training record does not keep someone out of the line of fire. A procedure does not isolate energy. Those things support a control. They create structure, they define expectations, they can strengthen the system. But in critical control management terms, they are support activities, not controls themselves. The ICMM guidance document defines control as an object, a human action, or a combination of both that directly prevents the unwanted event or mitigates the consequence. So that distinction can be quite uncomfortable for some. I know from in the mining industry, when several companies first went down this road of implementing critical control management in detail, what they actually found was that up to 80% of what they had originally been listed as controls were essentially support or administrative type controls in place or in nature. And that was an awakening and a sort of difficult lesson to learn from a lot of companies. You know, it meant that some unwanted events were mainly managed through lower order controls with limited higher order controls, if you think about the hierarchy of controls actually in place. And that left a lot of companies actually feeling really exposed, really anxious about whether we've got enough cover. But it was useful to go through that exercise because once you're able to see it, you can actually do something about it. You can strengthen your controls, you can look for higher order controls, you can improve verification, you can make go, no-go criteria more clearer. So this isn't about criticising plans, permits, or training because they are really important. As I said, it's a support network for your controls. But critical control management asks us not to confuse the things that support controls with the controls that actually prevent or mitigate serious harm. So the sharper question is, what actually prevents the fatal event, and how do we know it's working today? So this slide is about making critical control management practical. The image on the left is a good example of how critical controls can be brought closer to work. It's not a dense procedure. It's a simple visual of a mobile elevated work platform showing the hazards around a task. Trapping and crushing, falling from the basket, dropped objects, overhead energy sources, collisions and overturning. So people can recognize the work, they can see the hazard, and they can understand where the serious harm potential sits. People can this is where human performance principles are also very useful. You know, if you want people to identify and manage critical controls, the information has to be usable. You know, it needs to be visual, task-based, easy to understand, and and sort of close to the point of work. So the image on the right turns that visual into a verification checklist. So for each hazard, it would ask whether the relevant controls are in place and working. So it turns that idea of saying, we have a control in place, to have we checked that the control that matters for this task today is in place. But that verification shouldn't stop at being a tick box exercise. The real value is what we learn from the check and the continual checking process. What was working, what was weak, what was missing, what did we fix, what issues keep coming back, and what did leaders respond, or how did leaders respond when the answers were not comfortable? So these questions are important because critical control management only works if weak controls are surfaced and not hidden. The checklist, as I say, is not a control in and of itself. The checklist is part of that support network. It helps us to see whether the control is actually working and to actually do something about it if it's not. So where do I see this going for IMCA and more broadly for this audience as well? So I do not think that offshore marine needs to reinvent the wheel when it comes to this. There's a lot of strong work that already exists in organisations like IMCA, like the Marine Safety Forum, IOGP, G+, OCIMF, and their respective member companies. So I think the opportunity is to connect it better and make it more useful at the point of work. So for IMCA, I see this sitting across a few areas, and whether that's a particular work program around serious injuries and fatality prevention, the better use of safety data, again, that stronger learning loop through safety flashes and frontline communication, and I'll include the DP reporting in that as well. Having health and well-being and occupational hygiene as part of that core program as well. I think, I often think that health is the poor cousin to safety in a lot of conversations that happen in all different industries. So that's something I want to see how we can improve that going forward. I want to see stronger collaboration across sectors and clients. But I think what IMCA brings is the contractor voice, and that is central to all this. So, as many will know, contractors often carry a lot of the operational risk. They move between clients and projects. They see recurring problems across industry. They also see where requirements conflict, duplicate, or become hard to apply offshore. And that experience is really valuable, and it's part of that learning process that we want to be able to try and instill. So IMCA can help turn it into insights and practical guidance and better alignment and shared learnings. So I'll just close with this. So please consider this as just some of the hard-won learning from Under for Industry being shared with yourselves today. But I believe overall this will mean a sort of sharper use of data, sharper focus on serious harm, sharper verification of the controls that prevent fatalities, sharper learning from the events and near misses we already know are happening. And we know that most fatal events are not completely mysterious to us. The exact circumstances may surprise us, but if the broad pathways are usually known, then we can actually do something about it. We can name the hazards. The harder task is knowing which controls matter most, checking that they're working, and acting when they are not. So my ask is simple, really. It's around know the fatal risks, verify the controls, and share the learning. So really the next step is not more safety noise, it's about having a clearer focus. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's always really good learning where we can look outside of our own industry, see what others are doing, then take that back in and see how we can adapt that to our own industry and learn, and vice versa as well. think there's a lot of synergies between mining and offshore. We are putting people at the point of risk all the time, so these islands are really salient.
Absolutely. I think mining and offshore, I was trying to think about what are the main similarities, and it's things like working offshore versus working in mining, often in remote locations. You're in the middle of nowhere, quite often literally. You're often living cheek by jowl with people on the ships or in the mining camps. It's a very male-dominated industry and has relative issues there as well. There's heavy lifting that gets involved in all this in both sides. There's collision of vehicles, different types of vehicles, obviously, but so there are a whole range of different, there's a lot more similarities than there are differences, I believe.
Totally agree. Open the floor to any questions.
I have a question for you. I'm kind of a bit surprised seeing this out in the field, but I have, since I started in oil and gas many, many years ago, seen there is still a resistance within the offshore organizations we have. I'm not particularly thinking of a company represented here today, it's more in general, that it's seen as we don't want to report our incidents because people can think badly about us. What that means is that what I see offshore, which I know would have been a valuable lesson learned for all of us, doesn't get fed back to organizations like IMCA and so on. Is this something you are aware of actually still exists? That people and organizations doesn't want to expose their near misses, accidents and so on because it's seen as a business risk?
So I think there's two parts to that. One is about the data, and about the actual injury numbers and that sort of thing. As far as IMCA is concerned, I think we need to continue to work with, we have 400 odd contractor member companies, and there's a little bit of trying to make sure that we are communicating with them properly to make sure that they are aware of the value add of actually providing that data, to actually share that. And so we're always constantly looking at how we can improve and increase that level of response to those sort of things. When it comes to specific incidents, as a sort of membership organisation, we do rely on the voluntary nature of companies providing that information, or the information about incidents. We have a role to try and enhance and to sort of show what the value is in doing that, whether it's the moral or just the technical or even the financial ability to respond to incidents that are actually happening. But I agree with you. I think there is still some tension within some companies about legal aspects around sharing some things, reputational sort of aspects as well. We are very clear that when we produce our safety flashes that come out every couple of weeks, everything is stripped out, it's anonymized. We want to encourage that level of sharing between people, and we want to make sure that I think it's also really important to show that we've been doing safety flashes in IMCA for many years now, and I'm not aware of any incidents where it's led to a bad outcome, that someone has provided a safety flash or information for a safety flash and then has resulted in some sort of negative outcome for the company. So we need to tell that story a lot better, and really it's a leadership mentality that we need to maintain. And it happens in mining as well. When it comes to the actual data, everything's anonymous. You look at the IGP data, look at the IMCA data, we don't say what companies, we don't give a direct benchmarking. When I was at ICMM in the mining industry, you can look up the reports that I was writing for them, and each company is listed with their own data next to it, and of which you can directly benchmark different companies against yourself. So, and that's never been an issue. I mean, it took a while to get to that point, but I guess what I'm saying is if you have that leadership drive, you can, we should be able to do more with the data that we're getting.
Thank you. We've got a question right here.
Thanks for your presentation. Grant Wallace from Salosynesis. I have to declare a slight bias because we're involved in human factors and crew resource management training with a lot of operators. And what I think your excellent presentation about sharing the learning, I think as an industry, we don't look enough at work as imagined versus work as done and how we close the gap, because we're designing work in warm offices, but it's the front end teams that are out there in the cold dealing with the new challenges. And it's been mentioned once today, the word capacity is so important. How we create capacity for the people at the front line. And you touched on it. You said, more is less, because actually it damages capacity for leaders to actually deal with the team and manage situational awareness. But I just wondered, out of interest, is what I felt was missing, and I just wanted to hear your view on this, is crew resource management and that non-technical training, which is vital. In aviation, we work in that space as well. They learnt that 20 years ago, that most incidents, when they black box reviewed them, actually, it wasn't inexperience, it was highly experienced people that made mistakes. And it was about actually how they interacted with the teams, their authority gradient, their conversations or communication levels, just two elements. But I just wonder where you see that sitting within your organization, because I do think it's still missing to some extent.
Yeah, I think when it comes to, well, I think on that sort of pieces on communication and, what you might term some of the softer skills. I don't like saying that, but it's the easiest way to get across the point. When you look at human organization performance principles, or even high reliability organization principles, there are often aspects there around, making sure that it's really important to have the experienced people in there and to listen to experienced people and to make sure that they are able to express their views as appropriate during the course of the workday, and not defer to hierarchy within an organisation and those sort of things. But I agree. The communication and those aspects and how that sort of gets developed is really important. And I think I touched on that there in terms of that leadership piece. It's not just about senior leadership within the organisations. It's also about frontline managers and frontline supervisors, because, and I've engaged. Yeah, okay. I've engaged a couple of companies before where they've identified where it's actually that sort of middle management sort of piece that sometimes that gets lost in translation from what senior leadership is saying. It gets filtered through a middle management sort of piece and then gets through to the frontline managers as well. And so that's where that intent gets changed. So if you really want to be able to focus on that sort of middle management piece to make sure that those sort of messages come forward, I think.
One last question from Gareth at Vito.
Just a simple one. It was a good presentation. I know you mentioned the fact that coming from the mining industry and the industry that maybe they do seem far apart, but one of the biggest concerns in the marine industry still, and going back a decade, is incidents and fatalities in confined spaces. And I thought, with that background, I know operational reasons are different, but from your perspective and maybe from IMCA's, if that is a concern and maybe there are learnings, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when it comes to, when you look at the unfortunate causes of fatalities within the mining industry, the top of the list are vehicle interactions and mobile equipment, that sort of thing. Yeah, we talk about trucks the size of a house going around a huge pit and things like that. Then there's underground mining, you get fall of ground, which is rocks falling down on top of people. But then it gets into what is more universal, I suppose, which are the electrocutions, the confined spaces, the falls from height, the drop objects. So there's a lot of learning and a lot of crossover, there's a lot of shared wisdom from other industries that can be easily just, you know, if you look at like an 80-20 principle, you can take a lot of the learnings will probably be exactly the same because it's the same type of work. It's just out at sea rather than underground.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.